exactly doing? Sure. There we go. Got it. Okay. Okay. So as you can tell by the intro side, we are examining the fraud case of Volkswagen. First, we discuss Dieselgate, where Volkswagen used cheating software to pass the emissions tests set up by the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA. We then discuss how they were caught, which largely amounted to the testing their vehicles differently from what the software had anticipated or expected. Afterwards, we discussed the toxic culture in Volkswagen that created the conducive environment that allowed the fraud to happen. The toxic culture revolved around the coercive power by management, which created a win at all costs mentality. We follow up with the weaknesses in Volkswagen's control environment, particularly their negligent board of directors that ultimately allowed the fraud to occur. Lastly, we end our discussion by pointing out recommendations that addresses these specific control weaknesses. So let's define the fraudulent act committed by Volkswagen and how they were eventually caught. It's important to understand that for cars to be imported in the United States, they first have to pass the EPA's inspection that certifies that the vehicle conforms to the EPA's emission requirements. Vehicles that fail this certification are disbarred from being imported, which not only requires car manufacturers to spend billions on reworking their engines, but also delays revenue on the release of newer car models. Now, in an effort to sell their new 2016 models, Volkswagen had an aggressive marketing campaign which advertised their clean diesel engines, which they publicized as being an alternative to hybrids and electronic cars, because unlike regular gasoline engines, diesels release significantly less carbon dioxide to the environment. However, because diesels burn at a much higher temperature than regular car engines, they release considerably more nitrous oxide, which are incredibly toxic not just to the environment, but are also very dangerous to humans as well. Thus, the claim that diesel fuels were good for the environment was indeed very deceptive. Now, keep in mind that this is the late 2000s, early 2010 era, where not only hybrid vehicles were being immensely popular, but awareness of global warming grew exponentially. Additionally, at this time, Volkswagen had control of 70% of the diesel market that it wanted to protect. Thus, with all these pressures, Volkswagen installed emission software on all their imported cars that were purposely designed to defeat the EPA's emissions test. This software was so sophisticated that it could specifically recognize when it was undergoing an EPA test. And the way it works was that once the software realized it was being tested, the software would instantly change aspects of their engine, such as fuel pressure, exhaust gas recirculation, etc., in order to pass the test. However, while the software was sophisticated enough to determine when it was being tested at a lab, the software would not kick in under normal driving conditions. Thus, Dieselgate was Volkswagen essentially violating the law. Now, their vehicles weren't compliant to the standards, and thus their cars should not have been sold in the first place, at least in the United States. Additionally, they attempted to cover up their vehicle's failure to meet these standards through these defeat devices, which further adds to their immoral behavior. It's important to note that all this lying and cheating to meet the test is to enhance their bottom line. Volkswagen's breaking of EPA laws has a direct relationship to the financials because the appearance that diesel cars are capable of low fuel emissions would undoubtedly accelerate sales, which in turn would impact Volkswagen's profits. Thus, Volkswagen essentially committed financial statement fraud through an indirect way by breaking the emission standards, or failing the emission standards, What eventually led them to being caught, though, was just sheer coincidence. There's a certain environmental board in Europe who was just frustrated with how car companies kept fighting against emission regulations in Europe. And yet these same car companies, particularly Volkswagen, of course, were able to sell cars in the US which had significantly tougher standards. The environmental board just believed that Volkswagen was just using tech in America that they didn't want to use in European vehicles. And so the environmental board just wanted to demonstrate that if it worked in the US, it could also work in Europe. They outsourced this testing to an American research center who then performed road testing as opposed to the standard test done in a control center like the EPA would do. Thus, since testing was done outside of the traditional testing parameters, the software failed to regulate the engine, and basically the cheating was discovered. Now we get to the cultural aspects of our presentation, which Michael will present. Okay. Now, it would not be inaccurate to say that Volkswagen operates like a military dictatorship, where all its power rested in one man and his close circle of friends. In Volkswagen's case, that dictator was Ferdinand Piëch, who at the time of Dieselgate was the chairman of the board of directors, but had also previously served as their CEO for decades. He was also the grandson of Ferdinand Porsche, the founder of Volkswagen, and if you couldn't tell by his last name, the founder of Porsche too. While calling Volkswagen a family-run business with a dynasty-type power would be completely inaccurate, the Piëch family did have a high degree of influence in the company, and it gave Piëch that air of untouchability in Volkswagen. Now, Piëch was a real piece of work because one of the ways he pushed employees was to threaten them with firing if they failed to meet his demands. In other words, he exercised coercive power to the extreme. For example, a journalist asked him, what happens if your engineers won't be able to deliver? And this is his response. Then I would tell them that they're all fired, and I will bring in a new team, and if they can't do it, I will fire them too. And so that's an exact quote from Piëch himself. Now, because of how Piëch dictated his employees, it set a tone at the top of how managers would treat their subordinates. This is particularly true of Winterkorn, who was not only Piëch's number one protege, but also the chief executive officer during the Dieselgate scandal. Like Piëch, Winterkorn also ruled through fear. And in fact, in many group meetings, Winterkorn would not only mercilessly criticize managers in public, but he would also demote any manager who failed to meet his goals. Thus, from an employee point of view, you'd have to give utter obedience or just risk being fired or demoted. In addition to how he dealt with employees, Peach also ran the business in an aggressive, warlike fashion. For example, during a scandal when Volkswagen poached one of GM's managers and scored some confidential documents, Peach actually said that Volkswagen and GM were at war and that he would win by any means necessary. This warlike attitude of dominance and competition would spread to all employees, and it would eventually be the main pressure in causing the Dieselgate fraud. In regards to the Dieselgate scandal, top management actually instructed engineers to build the device. Even though it bothered the engineers' conscience, they went along with it anyway because, as mentioned before, utter obedience was the culture of Volkswagen. Regardless, just as the Ford Pinto case, Volkswagen underestimated the legal risk of getting caught with defeat devices, and they made the utilitarian calculation to go forward with cheating the emissions test. Alright, so now we move on to the control issues related to the fraud triangle. As you know, weak internal controls often lead to opportunities to commit fraud. As we learned in the class, the board of directors are elected to keep management and their self-interest in check. However, in the case of Volkswagen, they just went along with the dictatorship type of management that Peach and later Winterkorn would employ, because all they cared about was the bottom line. As mentioned previously, there were other scandals besides Dieselgate, such as taking confidential information from GM during Peach's Krieg or war against them. But rather than being like a red flag, the board took no action because Peach brought them immense growth and profits with his innovations. Furthermore, during the time of Dieselgate, when Peach actually stepped down from being CEO, he was elected to be chairman of the board, while his main protege, Winterkorn, went on to become the next CEO. Because of this close relationship between the board chairman and the CEO during Dieselgate, the board is unable to keep a tight leash on management. Furthermore, rather than guarding over stakeholders' interests, Peach undoubtedly was pulling strings and still running the business behind the scenes during his tenure as board chairman. To put it in another way, it's unlikely that Peach would fire Winterkorn because of their kind of mentor-student relationship, and because Peach can still effectively run, or at the very least monitor, the business through Winterkorn. Also, it's just generally bad corporate governance for a retired CEO to become a chairman of the board, because they'll be so concerned with protecting their legacy that they may block necessary changes in the company. So now we move on to the pressure aspects of the fraud triangle. As mentioned previously, Peach himself had the mentality of winning by any means necessary. This competitive mindset definitely influenced the culture of Volkswagen. As I mentioned in the intro, the Dieselgate scandal took place around the mid-2010s when the whole Toyota hybrid fad was in full swing. And so Volkswagen, they were really emboldened that their diesel strategy worked in Europe. And so they felt confident that they could take on Toyota and win in the United States. Thus, from fraudulently advertising that they were clean energy to putting cheap device in all their vehicles, Volkswagen did go in an all-out war against Toyota in the United States. In other words, they would win no matter what it took, even if it meant lying and cheating to achieve victory. So now we get to the rationalization aspect of the fraud triangle. When the prototype of the Volkswagen defeat device was first developed, they had one important meeting to essentially receive the green light from management to put the device into production. And while it's true that some people knew it was wrong and didn't want to cheat, a majority of the people who attended the meeting rationalized that, hey, all car makers cheated and that for Volkswagen to survive, they had to cheat too. Cheat to remain competitive, basically. So here we see that the mentality of win by any means necessary even influence the rationalization of committing fraud. Additionally, as previously mentioned, Volkswagen was a company run through fear and intimidation. Lower level employees were expected to give blind obedience, or else they would risk losing their jobs. It wasn't an environment where one could just raise concerns openly. Rather, they had to keep their mouths shut, or else they would face reprisal. Thus, I would claim that the argument that people were just following orders would definitely be one of the rationalizations used in justifying their fraudulent behavior. Now we proceed on to recommendations, which Don will present. Alright, so first and foremost, we have to address the weak internal controls that ultimately provided the opportunity to commit fraud. And that's the lack of separation between the board of directors and management. As previously mentioned, it's the duty of the board of directors to keep management in check by making sure that management acts in the interests of their stakeholders as opposed to themselves. However, there were two main problems in achieving this goal with Volkswagen. First, the board was too focused on growth and profits, and they didn't care about the actual means in achieving said growth. So in other words, ends justify the means. Our recommendation is that the board get rid of Peach and any of the old guard complicit in the fraud. The fact that they failed to rein in the consistent fraudulent behavior from management signals that the board failed to do its job and failed to meet their main objective, and thus they deserve to be fired. The hope is, of course, to replace them with people who actually care about doing things in the morally correct way. By having a board that can fix the culture and emphasize behaving ethically, the company can hopefully shed its unethical methods and develop a new one of correct priorities. For example, believe it or not, Volkswagen actually did have a code of conduct prior to the whole Dieselgate scandal, and yet no one bothered to follow it. Why? Because Peach and upper management created such a toxic tone at the top that it produced a culture where the code could not be followed. Our second recommendation really relates to all three aspects of the fraud triangle, but I put it here under pressure, which is to completely change the culture. Although this is definitely easier said than done, it's still possible. One way would be to adopt a new core system of values, a statement of values, my apologies, that emphasizes not only ethical behavior, but also employee empowerment. Because of how power was all centralized by Peach and his proteges, the power structure has to be broken, or else it will repeat even with new people elected. Because of their rule through fear, people were too scared to speak up. Thus, rather than a hyper-aggressive culture that expected blind obedience, Volkswagen should emphasize core values that talk about working together as a team and being a community that looks out for the public good. Our last recommendation is to create whistleblower hotlines where people can report fraudulent activities. This goes hand in hand with the previous point because you need to first eliminate the culture of fear before a whistleblowing function can actually work. If you recall, prior to the release of the defeat device, they had at least one last meeting to determine whether they should greenlight the misleading electronic software. Although the majority believed that cheating was commonplace and the only way to get ahead, some in that room knew it was wrong, but they were too afraid to speak up because of the potential reprisal. Thus, if a whistleblower hotline were established, and if they had a different culture, as pointed out in the previous slide, I'm sure someone would have whistleblowed, and the whole thing might have stopped before going forward. And that's basically it for our presentation. Thank you.